Bethany Hawthorne had allies, contractors, a consultancy, and a security firm that followed orders for pay. Her mistake was turning enforcement into a business transaction, and those transactions left a digital trail. Invoices, GPS logs, and deleted emails. Those records would later be the backbone of an investigation that turned neighborhood gossip into federal evidence. If part 2 made you angry, part 3 tightens the screws. This is where payments, GPS logs, and a whistleblower's conscience turn. Suspicion into momentum. The tactics stop being abstract. The evidence starts to speak. Where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments. Once the subpoena arrived, Willowbrook's slow-motion implosion accelerated. Subpoenas change how people act. They are legal hammers. They make private things public or at the least force disclosure. The community center, filled with boxes of records and volunteers who had spent long afternoons stapling minutes and receipts into manila folders. There was a new urgency in the air, a legal tempo that did not respect habitual politeness. The first momentum beat. In this second rising arc was the arrival of federal agents in plain clothes. They walked the block politely and carried clipboards. The presence of men and women who did not look to Bethany for permission complicated her narrative. Their questions were clinical. They requested digital copies of emails and hard drives. Their presence made it clear the matter had graduated from local politics to federal inquiry. Bethany responded with posture. She called a press briefing and framed the inquiry as an overreach that threatened community autonomy. Her speech was practiced. The cadence of entitlement softened into victimhood. She performed indignation the way an actor performs rage. It had been rehearsed to the point of credibility in the eyes of the credulous. The forensic accountant testified that payments listed in HOA books had been laundered through a vendor account. The vendor's address traced back to a shell company, registered to the councilman's aide. The paper trail was ugly and specific. For residents who had told themselves this was a simple disagreement about vehicle aesthetics, the testimony was a psychological blow. The possibility of conspiracy was no longer a rumor, but a formally presented observation. Perceived loss surfaced. When insurance companies received notice of potential fraud in HOA filings, an auditor called the community to freeze accounts pending review. The freeze meant no new budgets for landscaping or street repairs. A community that relied on those services would now endure sad, patchy lawns and a palpable sense of suspended normality. Quiet dysfunction is its own kind of punishment. The neighborhood's social fabric frayed. The once friendly block parties contracted into small guarded meetups. The social ritual of lending yard tools came with new hesitations. People who had once trusted Bethany now compared notes and discovered oddities in minutes and invoices. Obscure payments labeled as community consulting or compliance training with no deliverables attached. Momentum beat too. A whistleblower came forward. An administrative assistant at the community center disclosed that a set of emails had been deleted from the HOA's official account the same week the emergency addendum was introduced. The assistant, who had worked there for years and had the look of someone exhausted by small deceptions, provided printed copies of email headers and timestamps that suggested intentional deletion. Deleting records to reshape history is a tactic of cover-up. As federal agents consolidated evidence, Bethany's support base shrank. The councilman distanced himself. The security firm's contract was suspended pending investigation. People who had once relied on the veneer of tidy streets found their return on that investment uncertain. Property values are as much about perception as anything. A scandal down the block can reduce the market's appetite for risk. An emergency injunction halted the sale of any property connected to the development consultancy. The injunction bought time for residents like me. It also meant the developer could not close on the parcels while the investigation continued. Time is often the most tactical asset in legal fights. But the pressure increased in other ways. Anonymous smear flyers began appearing on windshields and in mailboxes. The flyers contained half-truths and inflammatory wording implying criminal behavior by residents who opposed the board. This low-level harassment was designed to isolate dissenters and to signal that opposition carried social costs. The tactic was not new. It is effective because it converts neighbors into surveillance and gossip into civic enforcement. A major setback arrived when a witness who had recorded gate footage found his door key missing the morning after he shared the video. He reported a suspicious visit the night before, a polite request by an unmarked intermediary asking about his comfort with neighborhood standards. Intimidation reframed as concern is the cloak under which coercion moves. The legal front advanced. Federal subpoenas multiplied. The agency filed notices asserting that the Jeep's handling might have violated statutes protecting government property, and that any access to onboard equipment required an investigation. The probe widened and drew in more than local actors. It began to circle the private security firm, the development consultancy, and the councilman's finances. Emotional stakes tipped higher. My sister received a threatening message at school, indicating her job could be endangered if the controversy continued. The person who sent it never identified themselves, but the implication that teachers associated with controversy might be disciplined carried weight with administrators, who depend on community goodwill. The harassment was calculated to slice at our networks until we stood alone. The neighborhood began to feel like a stage with spotlights trained on certain families. Those spotlights brought scrutiny, gossip, and sometimes pity. Some residents banded together to form a citizens committee to demand transparency from the HOA. Others demanded that the investigators leave the community alone. Those divisions hardened into formal motions and counter motions at board meetings. A pivotal setback escalated when a private investigator working for the consultancy published a report alleging the Jeep had been used for unauthorized surveillance of private property. The report offered no verifiable evidence but included redacted images and suggestive captions. The smear campaign's purpose was clear: muddy the waters and create public doubt about the true benign intent of the equipment. In response, the agency produced a certified letter clarifying the equipment's purpose and confirming chain of custody protocols had been violated. The letter mentioned statutes and the potential for criminal charges if tampering with government property was found. Legal language has a particular chill. Certain words make administrators move from posture to action. Momentum beat 3 occurred when federal marshals quietly placed an asset hold on certain HOA accounts linked to suspicious payments. The hold meant that any attempt to move funds would trigger legal alarms. It was a small bureaucratic action that signified a change in leverage. Federal authority had intervened in what was once a local quarrel. By now, the personal calculus changed for many. Some residents who had profited socially or financially from the status quo made hurried attempts to distance themselves. Others, scarred by the spectacle and legal exposure, began to plan exit strategies. The social exodus crystallized into a practical problem. Markets dislike uncertainty, and when families leave, the character of a neighborhood shifts. The second reveal came from a source nobody had expected to speak up: the private security guard who had worked Bethany's weekend patrols. He walked into a community meeting in an oversized jacket and a defeated look and said 2 sentences that redirected suspicion like a gust of wind. He confessed that he had been offered bonuses for compliance events and that the bonuses had come through the consultancy's account. That confession filled a room with a low, surprised murmur. The guard's admission translated a pattern into an architecture. Money flowed from consultancy to consultant, consultant to security, security to enforcement. The chain suggested orchestration rather than incidental action. An enforcement culture had been monetized. He explained quietly how the consultancy had provided enforcement playbooks, lists of behaviors to flag, scripts for notices, and steps to maximize pressure on homeowners. The playbooks turned into small rituals, repeated across streets. The same notices, the same contractors, the same timing. The revelation made it look like theater where actors were being paid to perform roles that created the illusion of community consensus. For some residents, the confession provoked shame. For others, it provoked outrage. A small group of neighbors who had been quiet or complicit for months stood and apologized for having trusted the polished look of governance more than the reality. Apologies are a kind of social accounting, attempts to rebalance trust after it fractures. But the second reveal introduced complexity. A few people testified that they had been offered cash or promises of faster property approvals if they signed petitions or supported emergency motions. Those offers shifted the narrative from mere poor governance to ongoing bribery and corruption. Where small financial incentives exist, ethical calculations become transactions. A momentum beat then came when the forensic accountant cross-checked bank records with invoices and discovered duplicate charges. An invoice for compliance training matched a check to a shell company on the same day as an operational bonus transfer to a security manager. The accountant called it pattern diversion. The fine tightened the net around those who had benefited. But the reveal carried personal consequences. The councilman's aide, the same person whose shell company had been used, resigned and fled the town, leaving his house sale pending. Flight implies guilt to some observers and merely prudent retreat to others. The image of a person packing a single suitcase and driving out of town is a vivid symbol in small communities. Perceived loss deepened for households on the developer's target list. Buyers who had expressed interest withdrew when the scandal hit news feeds. Real estate agents called, hesitant and apologetic. The house on the corner that had been painted to appeal to marketers now sat empty with a for sale sign that seemed to look ashamed. Plans that had seemed inevitable now sat in the cold light of public scrutiny. An emotional beat. My sister received a message from a parent of one of her students telling her to be careful, that the neighborhood's attention had turned sinister. It wasn't a legal threat, but a social one. It felt invasive in the way it implied vulnerability. The small intimacies of life had become battlegrounds. Near when a grand jury subpoena was issued that compelled testimony from Bethany and several key figures. The grand jury's involvement meant potential criminal indictments if the evidence supported charges. The legal gears moved toward formal accusation, and that prospect made some beneficiaries quiet. But this progress brought retaliation. Anonymous. Smear campaigns intensified and moved online. Social media profiles of those who had testified were targeted with fake allegations and doctored images. Cyber harassment adds a digital sting to physical intimidation, expanding the theater of pressure beyond the cul-de-sac. A crucial revelation by the security guard surprised everyone. He handed a memory card to the investigators that contained GPS logs showing the tow truck had traveled not only to the off-site yard, but also to a private garage associated with the consultancy, a place not listed on any official invoicing. The log suggested a stop where equipment might have been removed or examined. The memory card was small but explosive. Federal agents moved quietly on that lead. They obtained search warrants for the private garage, and their execution of the warrant produced evidence bags and sealed boxes. Photographs from the raid later showed tools, paperwork with redacted names, and a photograph of Bethany in conversation with a man from the consultancy, pointing at a map of Willowbrook with certain lots circled. The second reveal transformed suspicion into probable cause in the minds of many. The handoffs, emails to shell companies, payments to contractors, the GPS logs began to cohere into a narrative of intentional displacement and profit-seeking. It was not merely the removal of one Jeep. It was a tactic in a campaign to redesign a neighborhood for private gain. The emotional cost was palpable. Longtime residents who had planned to age in place now considered whether their futures might be bought out. A woman who had raised children in the same house for 40 years told a reporter she felt betrayed by the very people charged with stewarding the community. Her words hit the page with the soft, brittle ache of public exposure. The build toward the courtroom intensified quickly after the garage raid. Investigative reports, sealed indictments whispering at the edges, and neighborhood meetings that no longer felt social but evidentiary. Journalists camped on porches. People who had once exchanged recipes now exchanged affidavits. The first intense moment in the build was Bethany's arraignment. It was not theatrical. She appeared to answer questions and was formally notified of potential charges. Even in a mundane courtroom room, the presence of federal counsel and the brass of law felt weighty. The arraignment signaled that the dispute had crossed the line from messy local politics into prosecutable territory. Momentum beat one in this build. The prosecution assembling financial exhibits and emails linking consultancy payments to enforcement. Events! Momentum beat two. whistleblowers, and the memory card tying actions to places. Momentum beat 3, witness cooperation with prosecutors. Each element tightened the net. The build ends at an evidentiary hinge. Search warrants executed, boxes of records removed, the consultant cooperating, and a grand jury moving toward indictment. The quiet of the neighborhood at night grew heavier, as if everyone was listening for the next sound. The guard handed over a tiny memory card, GPS logs and time-stamped footage, and what it showed tied the tow to a private garage and a string of suspicious payments. Next, the courtroom would begin to hear those connections out loud. If a guard or whistleblower came forward with evidence in your town, would you believe them right away or wait for official proof? Why? Tell me in the comments.